Hello everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final episode of our 5-episode series on the virtues. I'm Charles Merritt, and today we'll wrap up our consideration of the virtues by looking at the last two of the moral virtues, those being temperance and justice. If you've been tracking through with us, you know that in episode 1 we looked at the virtues in general, found out what they were, well, what they are, what they do, and the two different categories, the theological and the moral. Episodes 2 and 3, we looked at the 3 theological virtues in particular: faith, hope, and love or charity. Last episode, episode 4, we looked at the first 2 of the moral virtues, prudence and fortitude. And this episode, episode 5, our 5th and final one, we'll look at the 2 remaining moral virtues, those being temperance and justice. So, and we'll look at them just exactly in that order. We'll treat temperance first, and then we'll finish off with justice. So the moral virtue of temperance, what does it enable us to do? Well, it enables us to pursue and to engage in certain things to pursue and engage in certain things, as we say, within right reason, without overindulging in them, without misusing them, abusing them, or worse, perverting them. And in particular, this virtue targets 2 what are called faculties we have. We have the digestive faculties, that being food and drink, and the necessity of those. And we also have the generative faculty, the procreation, sexual intercourse. So this particular virtue targets those 2 faculties, the digestive and the generative. And it helps us moderate and rightly use those faculties: food, drink, and sexual intercourse. Use them within the confines and the designs of how God intended them to be used. And like I say, not misuse them, abuse them, or pervert them in any way. And again, a very important virtue, because if you think about it, food and drink are necessary for our individual continued survival. Procreation, sexual intercourse, is necessary for the continued survival of the human race. So the faculties this virtue targets, in their own ways, are very significant, very critical. And significant and critical and as necessary as they are, again, they have to be used rightly. They have to be used within right reason. They have to be used within the design and context that God intends for them to be used. And in order to do that with our fallen human nature, we need grace. And the virtue that gives us the grace to use these things the way God has designed them to be used, to use them within right reason, that grace is delivered to us in this particular virtue of temperance. So, again, just like we said last episode when we looked at fortitude, fear in itself is good. It can be used rightly or wrongly. Boldness in itself is good, although it can be used rightly and wrongly. The pleasure attached to these things, the pleasure of eating, the pleasure of drinking, the pleasure of sexual intercourse, the pleasure in itself is good. God attached pleasure to them so that we would engage in them, because God knows we have to eat. So He attached pleasure to that. We have to drink. We have to stay hydrated. God attached pleasure to that. Again, within the proper confines, marriage between a man and a woman, God attached pleasure to procreation, to sexual intercourse. So since these things are necessary, used in the right way, since these things are necessary, God attached pleasure to them so that we would engage in them. So the fact that God attached pleasure to these things tells us pleasure in itself, in and of itself, is good, but just like fear, just like with boldness, it can be used, it can be misused, abused, or perverted. So we want to use if I want to say this, that we want to engage in or experience, I should say, the pleasure attached to these things in the correct way. And in order to do that, we need grace. That grace is given to us in this virtue. So let's take a look at, a little closer look at how this virtue does what we just say it does. All right. Now, first of all, we're talking about temperance, meaning the proper, the balanced use. Because in food, like we've talked about in these other virtues, you don't want to operate on the extremes. These virtues allow us to kind of take a middle line. They allow us to, they incline us to the good and away from the bad. They incline us to the proper use of these things and away from the improper use. And in order to do that, like we said, with our fallen human nature, we need grace. So when we're talking about food, we can certainly overeat or we can undereat. Either of those compromises our health. In drink, we can overdrink or we can underdrink. Both of those compromise our health. In sexual intercourse, we can engage in sexual intercourse and experience the pleasure of it in the correct way, between a man and a woman within marriage, or we can experience the pleasure of it in the wrong way, adultery, fornication, etc. So this virtue allows us to, yes, experience the pleasure God attached to these things, but experience that pleasure through the correct usage of them rather than the incorrect usage of them. That's what this virtue, specifically the grace in this virtue, enables us to do. It enables us to use the digestive faculties and the generative faculties in a way God designed them to be used within the proper context, within right reason. That's what this virtue does. Now, there are several aspects. Just like we said, prudence had several aspects, fortitude had several aspects. This virtue, temperance, has several aspects, or if you will, subsets of it. And I'll go ahead, like I did before, I'll list what they are, and then we'll kind of attach examples to them so we can kind of visualize. So subsets or aspects of the virtue of temperance, we've got abstinence, we've got fasting, in regards to the digestive faculties, the digestive aspect of this virtue. And then we've also got chastity and purity and modesty in regards to the generative faculty, the generative aspect of this particular virtue. And when I say abstinence and fasting on the one hand, when I say chastity, purity, and modesty on the other hand, a lot of us, obviously we're familiar with those terms, but a lot of us say, well, abstinence and fasting, is there really a difference? And if there is, what is the difference? Or is it just two different ways of saying the same thing? And in fact, they are two different things. Chastity, purity, modesty. Again, likewise. Is there a difference between those three? And if there is, what is the difference? Or is this a case of, calling the same thing by three different names? And again, like we said, there are three different things. So abstinence and fasting are distinct things. Chastity, purity, and modesty are distinct things. All of those are subsets, aspects of temperance. So our next job is to understand, after understanding what the virtue is and what it enables us to do, is to look at each of these aspects or subsets and properly define them. So let's take the two digestive aspects of this particular virtue, abstinence versus fasting. What's the difference? Well, abstinence is the refraining from the use of a thing. Whereas as fasting is refraining from the use of the thing for a specific period of time. So let's take an example, coffee. I can exercise abstinence in terms of coffee by refraining to drink coffee, period. I can engage in fasting in regards to coffee by refraining to drink it just for a period of time, like maybe during Lent. So, to use a phrase, if I swear off coffee forever, for the rest of my life, abstinence. If I swear off coffee for Lent, a limited period of time, that's fasting. So that's the difference, probably the easiest and clearest and most direct distinction that we can draw between abstinence and fasting. They both engage in a refraining of the use of something or the refraining of engaging in something. Abstinence is the refraining of engaging in it, period. Fasting is the refraining of engaging in it for a period of time. So that's the difference between abstinence and fasting, and both of those are subsets of the digestive aspect of this particular virtue. Now, in terms of the chastity, the purity, the modesty, the subsets that kind of align with the generative aspect of this virtue, what's the difference among those three? Well, chastity, what that does is it moderates the sexual appetite. It moderates our desire for sexual pleasure. Key word there is moderate. So, we have a sexual appetite, but it has to be used, properly, within the confines God designed it to be used in, right? So, it enables us to be able to use it in that fashion. It moderates the sexual appetite. It moderates our desire for sexual pleasure. It brings it within right reason. It enables us to engage, to experience the pleasure, and therefore engage in this in a way that God intends. That's chastity. So if you say a person is chaste, what you're saying about that person is they have the ability, through the grace of this virtue, to moderate their sexual appetite, to moderate their desire for sexual pleasure, rather than, again, like we mentioned in the previous episode, become enslaved by it. All right? Now, what's the difference between chastity and purity? Well, chastity involves the sexual function, whereas purity involves things associated with the sexual function. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean things like having lustful thoughts, having lustful fantasies, using lustful words. Those are things associated with the sexual function. So chastity targets the sexual function itself. Purity targets those associated things, those things around the sexual function. Lustful thoughts, lustful fantasies, lustful words. And it helps us, avoid that end of the spectrum. So that's purity. Now, modesty goes kind of a step, there's a step further away. Modesty also targets things associated with the sexual function, but rather than lustful thoughts and fantasies and words, modesty helps us moderate the appearance and movements, which can also surround and be associated with the sexual function. So a person that's modest doesn't dress in a way that is deliberately designed to arouse another individual sexually. A modest person doesn't move their bodies in a way that's deliberately designed to arouse the sexuality in another person. So chastity involves the sexual function itself. Purity and modesty involve things associated with the sexual function. Purity with the lustful thoughts and fantasies that are associated with it. Modesty with, I would say, maybe the lustful movements and lustful appearance that are associated with it. And all of those are subsets of this virtue of temperance. So a chaste person, a pure person, and a modest person, they get the grace to be chaste, to be pure, to be modest through the grace of the overall virtue. These are subsets or aspects of which is the virtue of temperance. Because again, we have a fallen human nature. Our intellect is cloudy, our wills are weak. We need help being chaste and being pure and being modest. God gives us that help through grace, and He gives us the particular grace to keep these within right reason through this particular virtue of temperance. So that's temperance, and those are its various aspects or subsets. Now, the final moral virtue is justice. And this moral virtue, big picture, what it allows us to do is it allows us to give the other person their just due. And the reason we should give the other person their just due is how we should see and look at that other person as an adopted son or daughter of God, created in the image and likeness of God. Since that's who that person is, we want to give that person their just due. But again, we've got fallen human natures. So we need grace to help us do that. And the grace to help the other person, to help us give the other person their just due, that particular grace to do that is delivered in this particular virtue, the virtue of justice. So that's what it enables us to do, give the other person their just due, and that's why we want to do it, because of who they are, child of God, made in the image and likeness of God. Now, we say give the other person their just due. So the next thing we've got to talk about is a proper definition of person. Now you might be saying, well, Charles, we know what a person is. Well, yes and no, because there are several different types of persons. The first type of person is the person we most think of, the human person. So one way we define person is the human person, the human being. All right? That's a human person. But there are also three different types of what we call moral persons. Those three different types, we have business organizations. They're considered to be a moral person. Religious communities, they're considered to be a moral person. Nations, countries, they're considered to be a moral person. So when we say justice enables us to give the other person their just due, now we know when we say that word person, you basically have the human person, and then you have three moral persons: businesses, religious communities, and nations. And all of those and each of those we're called to give them their just due. And the grace that helps us do that is this virtue, justice. Now, the next thing we should talk about is what, practically speaking, because we define what a person is, what, practically speaking, represents their just due? Because we have to give the other person, be them human or moral, right, their just due. So how do we determine what the other person's just due is? Now we have to take a look at the situation and the circumstances. So if you look at this virtue, in order to practice it, give the other person their just due, we have to know what represents their just due according to the situation and the circumstances. We have to know that. So we have to use our intellect. And then once we know it, we actually have to render the just due. We actually have to do it. That comes from our will. So this virtue of justice operates on both the intellect and the will. So person, human, and the three moral persons just due depending on the situation and the circumstances. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper. Practically speaking, what would this look like? Can we hang a couple of practical examples on giving another person, be they human or moral, their just due? Let's take a look at a couple of examples here, okay? Because there's two types. Just like each of these virtues had different aspects or subsets to it, justice is no different. When we look at the virtue of justice, there's two aspects or two subsets. There's what's called commutative justice, and there's what's called distributive justice. And let's take a look at each of those types of justice, each of those aspects of justice. We'll define them, and then we'll attach some examples to them. And in defining and attaching examples to the two aspects of justice, we'll have a better idea of what this virtue actually looks like, practically speaking. Now, commutative justice, that's justice strictly between two persons. Be them two human persons, be them two moral persons. Commutative justice is a person-to-person justice. Now, what are all the different permutations of this? It could be human person to another human person. It could be business to business. It could be human person to business. It could be religious community to religious community. It could be human person to religious community. It could be nation to nation. It could be human person to nation. So commutative justice is one person to another person in all the different types of persons that can be involved. Human, business, religious community, and nations. So it's a person-to-person rendering of that person's just due. That's commutative justice. And it basically looks at the proper give and take between those two persons, the rights and the obligations between those two persons. Because when we're talking about rendering just due, what does that involve? It involves give and take. It involves rights and obligations. And commutative justice targets the give and take, targets the rights and obligations between one person, human or moral, and another person, human or moral. So it's a person-to-person rendering of just due involving the give and take and the rights of obligations between those two persons. That's commutative justice. Now, let's attach a couple of examples of what this might look like real time. Suppose I borrow your lawnmower. I say, hey, Simon, can I borrow your lawnmower? Simon says yes. And I say, thank you. I'll have it back to you by 5 o'clock this afternoon. All right? So look at the give and take. Look at the rights and obligations between, in this case, two human persons, Simon and I. All right? He's lending me his lawnmower, and I promise to give it back by 5 o'clock. Now, if I give it back, what justice requires me to do is A, give it back to him in the same condition that he lent it to me. I'm required to treat that lawnmower as if it was my own, so I can give it back to him in the same condition that he lent it to me. That's the first thing I got to do. The second thing I got to do, in addition to giving it back to him in the same condition that he lent it to me in, I've also got to give it back to him when I promised, 5 o'clock. Now, if I do that, if I return it in the same condition that he lent it to me in, if I've taken care of it as if it was my own, and I get it back to him by 5 o'clock, I have rendered him his just due. I have rendered him justice. I have practiced this virtue. However, suppose I trash the lawnmower and I give it back to him and it's broken. I have violated just due. Or let's say I give it back to him in good condition, but I give it back to him a week later and not 5 o'clock that afternoon. I have violated just due. So, the grace in this virtue helps me adhere to giving him just due. It gives me the grace to treat this lawnmower as my own, so I can give it back to him in the proper condition. And it gives me the grace to make sure I get it back to him by 5 o'clock. That's the just due I have to render him for the privilege of borrowing his lawnmower. In order for me to be able to do that and make sure I do that, again with my fallen human nature, I need grace, and the grace of this virtue gives me that grace. So that's one example, all right? Now, let's go with another one. Let's say that Simon, rather than lending me a lawnmower, let's stay with the lawnmower example, and let's kind of peel away a couple of more layers. Simon lends me the lawnmower, right? I say, great, I'll give it back to you by 5 o'clock. I take care of it. That's no problem. I go to his house. It's before 5 o'clock. So I'm in the process of rendering Simon just due. And then the door opens and I say, well, I'm here to give Simon back his lawnmower. And I'm told, well, Simon has passed away. Now, I say to myself, okay, I'm sitting here with Simon's lawnmower, right? Justice requires me to give it back to Simon. Well, Simon is no more. He's passed away. So what does that mean for me? Does that mean I'm off the hook? I don't have to give Simon back his lawnmower because there's no more Simon? I can keep it? No. Justice requires me that if the person I borrowed it from is no longer alive, then my next obligation is to give it to a member of his family. If none of his family is alive, my next obligation is to give it to one of his heirs. If he doesn't have any heirs, or they're not alive, right, then my next obligation would be to give it to the poor. If there's no poor people around, then my next obligation is to give it for a pious cause. In other words, I can't keep that lawnmower. It's not mine. Justice requires me to return it. To return it to the person I borrowed it from, if not their family, or if not them, their heirs, if not them, then the poor, if not them, their pious causes. Justice requires me to return that lawnmower to someone, all right, in that order, because it's not mine. So that's an example of the lawnmower, all right? Now, and that's an example of commutative justice. the rendering of just due between two persons. Now let's go with another example. Let's say I'm driving down the street and I'm going past Simon's house and I see Simon's garage on fire. Now what I should do, just like the lawnmower, I should return it in good condition at the time I promised. What I should do if I see Simon's garage on fire is I should call the fire department so they can come and put it out. I neglect to do that. I don't call the fire department. And as a result, the fire department doesn't come. And not only does the garage burn down, but all the contents he has in the garage is destroyed. And let's just put a price tag on it. Let's say he has $1,000 worth of stuff in the garage. So the garage is destroyed and he loses $1,000 of the worth of stuff he had in the garage. All right? Now, have I sinned? The answer is yes. Now I've sinned, I've sinned against a theological virtue of love, of charity. I've sinned against that theological virtue. Because remember what that theological virtue was. It was willing the good of the other, both physically and spiritually. And if I really am loving Simon, if I'm really willing his good, then I want his garage to remain intact. I want him to still have the stuff he has in his garage, and therefore I should call the fire department. Since I haven't, I've sinned against a virtue of love. I've sinned against a virtue of charity. Now, what about justice? What about rendering just due? Now, in this case, the question is, when Simon finds out I saw his garage on fire, when he finds out I could have called but didn't, then the idea of the concept of restitution comes into play. Do I have to provide restitution for him for the loss of his garage and the loss of the $1,000 worth of stuff in the garage? Again, now we move into situation and circumstances. Now, questions arise. Why didn't I call? If I didn't call because I can't stand Simon and I would get a lot of delight and joy out of seeing his garage and all those contents destroyed, is that the reason I called? I didn't call? Did I not call because I didn't have my cell phone? Did I not call because I figured somebody else would call? Did I not call because I figured somebody else had probably already called? Did I not call because I thought I heard sirens in the background, so I figured the fire department was already on the way? That's where it gets murky. That's why, we want to always err on the side of caution. We want to always do what these virtues give us the grace to do, and that is incline to the good and avoid the evil. So the best way of not having to navigate through all that murkiness is to not have the murkiness on the table in the first place. And the best way to not have the murkiness on the table in the first place is to call the fire department. Because had I done that, then all these other things, all this other murkiness, they would be a moot point. So what gives me the grace to do what I should do, period, and not try and go through, somebody else has probably called, maybe somebody else will call, etc., etc., etc. Just do the right thing. Call the fire department. So my intellect has to know that's the right thing, and my will actually has to perform the the operation of me picking up the phone and dialing 911 and calling. What gives me the grace to do the right thing, period? This particular virtue. Because I want to render, not only do I love Simon, not only do I will his good, but I also want to render him his just due, period. And his just due falls under me calling the fire department. Then we don't have to worry about all these other things and restitution or not, because if I call the fire department comes, puts out the fire, hopefully his garage is saved and his contents are still intact. But if the fire department can't put out the fire in time to save the contents, then I'm not responsible for that, because I did what I should have done, and that is I made the call in the first place. So all of those situations fall under commutative justice. One person rendering just due to another person, whether that person is a human being, a business, a religious community, or a nation. The other aspect of justice, the other subset is called distributive justice. And distributive justice is between a community and its members. And when we say the community, we're talking specifically about the people that are charged with care of the community. So the people that are charged with the care of the community, they have to render to members of that community their just due. Whether the members are in charge, I should say, no matter what the members are in charge of, whether we're talking police, fire, city council members, whatever, anybody in a position that's in charge of an aspect of that community's care has to render the members of that community just due. They have to distribute that just due among the members of that community they are charged to care for. Hence, that's distributive justice. And to give these people the grace to do that when maybe they don't feel like it or they don't like certain members or whatever, to rise above that, they need grace. They get that grace through this virtue of justice. So, because the whole idea behind this virtue, I should say one final thing before we close out this episode, and that is that no act is purely or solely isolated. Every act, no matter how large or how small, no matter how significant or insignificant, every act is not an isolated act. It affects someone or something. Even if it's only one someone, or even if it's only a small something, every act affects something. So no act is isolated. And since no act is isolated, since every act affects either something or someone or both, that someone or something that act affects, they're entitled to just due. So the practice of this virtue should be engaged in every time we perform an act, because every act affects someone or someone else. And when you're talking about affecting someone or someone else, you got to talk about giving that someone or someone else just due, which this virtue gives us the grace to do. You know the old adage, no man is an island. You know, people say that every act has a ripple effect or a butterfly effect. And that's really kind of the basis for this virtue, is the fact that there are no purely, solely isolated acts. Every act affects someone or something. That someone or something needs their just due. They have a right to it. This virtue enables us to do that. So with that wraps up our discussion of temperance. That wraps up our discussion of justice. That wraps up the four moral virtues, and it wraps up this series on the virtues. So as we bring the series to a close, hopefully you've left this series with like I say, a better understanding of and appreciation for virtues in general, what they are, what they do, the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, what they are and what they do, and the 4 moral virtues, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, what they are and what they do. And again, just to be clear, that when we say what the virtues do, it's understood that we're saying that we mean what the grace in those virtues do, because it's all grace. So with that, thank you for watching Fresh Catholic and supporting it. Thank you for watching and supporting this series. Until our next series, take care, God bless. I'm Charles Merritt.